Donald J. Trump's voice cut through the stifling, heavy silence of the Oval Office. Let me get this absolutely clear. They propped up a fully incapacitated figure as a candidate, strictly so she could cling to the presidency, and now this ruthlessly ambitious operative has the absolute audacity to crawl back onto television, pushing a memoir to mask the reality that she exploited her severely ailing husband for pure authority. There was zero trace of lightheartedness in the 47th president's delivery. It was piercing, merciless, and layered with the fierce rhythm of a man who had just trapped his rivals dead to rights. It was the scorching month of May in 2026, mere weeks ahead of a viciously fought midterm cycle that threatened to totally alter the nation's political map. The country's mood was wildly volatile, heavy with citizen exhaustion and boiling anger regarding the perceived double standards of the prior leadership. Positioned at the exact epicenter of this broadcast spectacle was former First Lady Jill Biden. Throughout the previous 30 days, she had engineered an aggressive, intensely synchronized media blitz, flooding all the major broadcast networks and daytime programs to market her freshly printed autobiography. Yet, for anybody familiar with the ruthless calculus of D.C. maneuvers, this was never merely about moving paperbacks. It functioned as a strategic, stealthy electoral push. She was painstakingly setting the foundation for a widely rumored Senate bid, frantic to emerge from the collapsing, ruinous shadow of her spouse and formally capture the political center stage on her own terms. However, her perfectly managed press run had suddenly struck a disastrous obstacle. A raw, uncut segment from an impending CBS Mornings sit-down had mysteriously spilled onto the web, expanding like an inferno throughout social channels before the corporate bosses could erase it. During that 30-second clip, the meticulously built facade ultimately fell away. When pushed regarding the catastrophic 2024 debate that effectively terminated Joe Biden's public life, Jill committed the absolute cardinal sin of politics. She spoke the actual truth. "I viewed it," she confessed in the recording, her tone shaking with what appeared to be authentic dread. "I told myself, good Lord, he is suffering a severe medical crisis. It terrified me completely. I was horrified, because I had never, ever witnessed Joe in that condition previously." Seated behind the resolute desk, President Trump tapped pause on his device, locking her panicked, wide-eyed look onto the high-resolution monitor. For a brief second, he remained entirely silent. He did not grab his phone to launch a scorching digital rant. He did not ridicule her panic. Rather, gazing at the paused image, he recognized something far more devastating. He identified the precise, undeniable structure of a legal trap. If she sincerely thought the commander-in-chief was enduring a major medical emergency on national broadcast, her subsequent moves that exact evening were far beyond normal public relations spin. They represented an intentional, malicious deception of the whole American populace. For Trump, this was not a mere blunder. It provided the supreme leverage to forever dismantle the altered history her camp was frantically attempting to peddle. Trump glanced upward toward his communications chief, his face settling into an icy, strategic sharpness. "Do not post a single syllable concerning this," he commanded, aggressively dropping the device screen down onto the wood. "Contact CNN immediately. Inform them I am formally agreeing to their offer for the live, primetime forum next week. But make it clear, I have one uncompromising demand." He tilted forward, pressing his fingertips together. "I refuse to have their hosts preaching at me. I require her. You advise the executives that I will solely step onto that platform if they place Jill Biden in the seat right across from mine. Live, zero stand-ins, zero ad breaks, absolutely nowhere to retreat. Let us watch how her little fabricated narrative survives when she is forced to meet my gaze and justify it. The setting abruptly transitioned from the chilly, strategic, and deeply sound-dampened quiet of the executive office to the glaring, disorganized core of the CNN production facility in Atlanta. It was exactly 20 minutes until broadcast, and the climate inside the space was completely stifling, electrified by a chaotic, undeniable tension. Crew members barked rapid-fire instructions over one another, tweaking the intense, blinding overhead rigs, and desperately verifying the real-time visual feeds. Directors wearing earpieces sprinted around the set, their expressions drained of color from the massive stress of the impending event. The oxygen inside the room felt impossibly dense, weighted by the daunting awareness of what they were preparing to air. A 90-minute, unrehearsed, and totally unshielded clash featuring two bitter political adversaries. There were zero large lecterns to conceal oneself behind. There were zero scrolling screens to rescue either from a devastating verbal mistake. There were merely two leather seats placed exactly 6 feet away from each other, right in the middle of the stage. A live viewing crowd gripping their shared breath, alongside a giant electronic timer on the backdrop, unforgivingly winding down to nothing. The supreme snare had been triggered, and the lenses were preparing to record. The electronic timer on the backdrop aggressively blinked to 0. A crimson bulb sparked to life above the primary lens. They were broadcasting. 90 minutes. 0 sponsor interruptions. 0 protective buffers. Good evening, and welcome to this exclusive CNN forum, Jake Tapper initiated, his tone strained, exchanging a brief, grave look with his fellow host, Abby Phillip. Tonight, we are accompanied by two monumental personalities of contemporary American governance for a historically unique dialogue. Please receive former First Lady Jill Biden, Abby Phillip proclaimed. Jill emerged initially. She appeared luminous, outfitted in a flawlessly fitted blazer, gesturing to the seated crowd with the rehearsed grace of a veteran operative. She did not present herself as a past partner, retreating from the glare. Her stance was intentional, projecting the assurance of an ideal stateswoman prepared to dive in and salvage the republic. She claimed her chair, deploying a welcoming, softening grin that appeared engineered to immediately diffuse the hostility in the space. And accompanying her, the 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Trump marched onto the platform. He refused to wave. He refused to pander to the attendees. He advanced with a weighty, authoritative stillness, a trademark partial grin resting on his face. He eased into the leather seat, immediately facing Jill, his frame loose yet unquestionably menacing. The visual disparity was instant. Two completely distinct tactical approaches existing within the identical environment. Tapper promptly pivoted to Jill. Dr. Biden, allow us to begin with you. You have lately released a heavily awaited autobiography, and recently you have been remarkably outspoken regarding the present trajectory of our nation. Why pen this manuscript currently? And what precisely is your thesis for the American populace this evening? Jill captured the opportunity perfectly. She angled forward, her voice saturated with practiced earnestness and elevated phrasing. Jake, I authored this manuscript because the spirit of our country is suffering at this moment. We are observing the present leadership dismantle the frameworks we dedicated 4 years carefully reconstructing. I wish to share the factual account of our era within the executive mansion, an era of openness, of safeguarding our republic, and of defending the objective facts. The American citizens merit a commander who operates in the sunshine, who brings us together, rather than someone who governs via fracturing, turmoil, and panic. She halted flawlessly, allowing the clapping from her demographic in the studio to build, trying to solidify her control of the narrative. Yet, the exact moment the clapping crested, Trump refused to hold for Abby Phillip to shift topics. He refused to rest quietly. He angled fiercely toward his microphone, elevating his right palm to immediately stop the hosts. "A fantastic monologue," Trump interjected, his pitch sinking into a deep, ridiculing cadence that sliced straight past the ovation. "Truly gorgeous, extremely touching, yet it is absolute and utter fabrication." Jill's welcoming grin contracted faintly. However, Trump afforded her not even a millisecond to reply. He released a brief, rejecting chuckle, swaying his head. "I genuinely must commend you, Jill. I truly do. I have consumed numerous manuscripts, but your latest autobiography, it is a brilliant work of fiction. Genuinely astonishing." He tilted deeper forward, his gaze anchoring onto hers, dismantling the courteous broadcast vibe entirely. "You rest there, preaching about openness and defending the facts, whilst you are covertly leveraging this minor promotional circuit to ignite a stealth run for the upper chamber. And exactly how are you accomplishing this? By acting like a redeemer, when in truth, you are merely attempting to campaign by seeking cover behind a spouse who had totally forfeited his mental faculties." A quiet gasp echoed across the viewing crowd. Jake Tapper parted his lips to mediate, yet Trump bypassed him, aiming an index finger straight toward Jill, his half-smile solidified into a freezing, unrelenting glare. "The American public is not foolish, Jill," Trump proceeded, his tone reverberating with massive tactical gravity inside the currently dead-quiet space. "They understand precisely what occurred. They witnessed it utilizing their personal vision. We do not require hearing an additional fabricated fable from a person who burned 4 years operating as the chief director of the most massive deception network in the capital. You never guarded the truth. You buried it. How does this situation appear to everyone? We could pivot directly into Phase 3, where the executive gatekeeping accusations are dismantled, or we could analyze the rhythm here before advancing." The quietness that suspended across the set trailing Trump's initial strike felt denser than a judicial hammer. The charge of a massive concealment had vacuumed the oxygen directly from the facility. Prior to Jill even trying to revive her meticulously managed Guardian of the Republic character, Trump aimed directly for the vital strike. There existed zero hesitation, zero deflection, and absolutely no compassion. "Let us discuss that supposed openness of yours, all right?" Trump leaned ahead, planting his arms atop his legs, his gaze locked upon her, featuring the hunting intensity of a raptor following its prey. Because throughout 4 years, the executive wing never functioned as a civic hub, assisting the American populace. It acted as a citadel. It operated as an isolated medical wing, and you served as the chief matron, blocking the primary entrance, wielding a checklist, determining whoever gained access to the commander and whoever received the ultimate career termination. He angled his head, his characteristic partial grin completely vanished, substituted by an icy, calculated severity. If a top strategist, an armed forces commander, or simply a junior aide ventured to step inside the executive workspace from the dawn of 2023 until the conclusion of your spouse's ruinous tenure and mentioned, "Perhaps the leader should not be greeting empty space this afternoon." What occurred to those people, Jill? You did not merely terminate them, you eradicated them. You hijacked the routine security summaries. You totally marginalized the primary administration director, and you armed the personnel division to methodically wreck the livelihoods of honorable civic workers. You revoked their classified access and hurled them directly onto the public streets. You functioned as the supreme, unvoted sentry, muting anybody who perpetrated the unpardonable offense inside your regime, speaking the undeniable reality. Jill's jaw clenched, her flawlessly rehearsed motherly affection starting to fracture beneath the weight. Yet Trump remained merely warming up. He fluidly intensified the offensive, shifting from executive isolationism toward the absolute center of the ruling class double standards. Yet, that sentry duty, that is merely the starter course. Trump pushed on, his voice dropping into a heavy, unrelenting register that echoed with political weight. The genuinely destructive element is exactly how you manipulated the public's residence into an impenetrable political shield for the domestic corporate syndicate. We witnessed federal prosecutors aggressively probing your household. Severe national graft inquiries stretching between 2018 and 2024. Massive sums of unjustified currency pouring over from foreign dummy corporations located in Ukraine and China. And what became your reaction? Trump tossed his palms skyward in a display of sarcastic incredulity. You declined to step aside. You declined to pull away out of reverence for the statutes. No, while the independent prosecutor is physically composing national charges for revenue evasion and firearm offenses, you summon the precise subjects of those national inquiries into elite executive banquets, such as the extravagant feast honoring the Indian leader during mid-2023. You march them descending the massive steps wearing formal wear, positioning them directly beside international leaders and digital tycoons, smiling for the lenses. He aimed his finger straight toward her, resembling an armed weapon. That was not merely bad visuals, Jill. That represented an underworld tactic. It stood as a shameless, strategic signal broadcast straight to each investigator within the justice sector. Observe us. We dine using executive porcelain. We remain completely invincible. And should you risk targeting us, you are targeting the throne itself. You weaponized the structural immunity of the office to operate an extortion ring. The collected, graceful exterior evaporated completely, substituted by the raw, unfiltered wrath of a tactical operative trapped under broad daylight. Jill snapped. Smack! Her flattened hand struck the top of the compact desk, separating them, the piercing noise slicing across the broadcast floor, resembling a firing weapon. The audience collectively recoiled. That remains a repulsive, unfounded fabrication. Jill fired back, her voice abandoning its soft, calculated rhythm for a sharp, authoritative shout. She positioned herself completely rigid, arming her premium Washington status to obscure the facts. You sit exactly there and toss about terms such as corruption, while you possess absolutely no foundational comprehension regarding how the apparatus functions. Those attendee records remained classified, intensely scrutinized, and totally shielded beneath the historic traditions of presidential privilege. She angled forward, her eyes flaring with a blend of authentic anger and strategic dramatization. My relatives have endured the absolute most exhausting, dishonest, legal scrutiny within contemporary American history. Exactly what you spitefully label a signal toward the authorities, the remainder of the rational globe identifies as precisely what it remains: an organized, partisan persecution. You failed to defeat us regarding legislation. Thus, you are resting here upon nationwide television, frantically attempting to prosecute my relatives, driven by sheer, toxic, individual vendetta. She refused to merely defend herself. She counterattacked, expertly wrapping her family's scandals inside the protective, impenetrable banner of victimhood. And inside the intensely polarized arena of the CNN studio, the maneuver ignited an explosive charge. The left side of the auditorium erupted into thunderous, ear-splitting applause, roaring their approval at her fierce defiance and flawlessly delivered legal jargon. Simultaneously, the right side responded with a ferocious chorus of jeers, rejecting her defensive spin. The moderators, Jake Tapper and Abby Phillip, frantically spoke into their earpieces, their attempts to regain control completely drowned out by the noise. The stage had officially transformed into a brutal, stalemated ideological war zone. The tension felt so thick a blade could cut it, with neither side willing to yield a single inch of ground. The deafening cacophony of cheers and heckling ricocheted off the studio walls, a visceral soundtrack to a fractured nation. However, Donald Trump did not flinch. He declined to elevate his voice to battle the noise, nor did he retreat from it. He simply waited. He sat with the terrifying stillness of a man who held the absolute winning hand, watching Jill Biden breathe heavily across from him, her eyes burning with a desperate, defensive fire. When the audience's roar finally began to fracture and fade, Trump leaned into his microphone. He refused to take the bait regarding her persecution narrative. He merely bypassed her complete emotional shield and swung a heavy sledgehammer directly into the most radioactive scandal of her husband's presidency. "You may play the martyr endlessly, Jill, yet the applause in this room cannot alter the medical records," Trump stated, his voice dropping into a deadly conversational register that instantly commanded the room's attention. "Because whilst you were occupied, transforming the Oval Office into an exclusive club for your relatives, you were concurrently executing the most dangerous, systematic cover-up in the history of the American Republic, hiding the rapid, undeniable mental deterioration affecting the commander-in-chief." Jill's breath caught. The polished armor she had worn so flawlessly all evening suddenly showed a massive, irreparable crack. "Let us examine the chronology," Trump continued relentlessly, weaponizing specific, unassailable data points. Spring of 2024, the G7 summit in Italy, the D-Day anniversary ceremonies in France. We possessed a president wandering away from global leaders, staring blankly into the distance, as if he were expecting a bus that was eternally absent. We witnessed foreign prime ministers gently grabbing him by the elbow to physically turn him around so he wouldn't walk into the bushes. And exactly what was your function? You were standing exactly there, managing a taxpayer-funded theatrical illusion, pretending everything was perfectly fine. Trump gestured to the audience, connecting the elite deception to the brutal reality of everyday citizens. "We observed single mothers in Pennsylvania and Ohio working 3 jobs simply to afford groceries that cost 30% more than they did 3 years prior. We witnessed small business owners getting crushed by a massive inflation rate, and they were expected to sleep soundly at night, knowing the man possessing his finger on the nuclear button didn't even comprehend what time zone he was in. You failed to merely deceive the press, Jill. You defrauded 330 million Americans. You maintained a man in office who was completely devoid of mental acuity because you were terrified of losing your grip on power." For the first time all night, Jill Biden genuinely faltered. She opened her mouth, but the razor-sharp legal jargon abandoned her. She looked utterly exposed, her eyes darting rapidly toward the edge of the stage. She was sinking, drowning under the weight of an indefensible reality. And perfectly on cue, the institutional media tossed her a life raft. Sensing the catastrophic collapse of their star guest, the 2 moderators abandoned all pretense of journalistic neutrality. The debate instantly, violently morphed from a one-on-one showdown into a 3-on-1 institutional blockade. "Mr. President, we have to stop you exactly right there," Abby Phillip interjected, her voice artificially elevated, cutting across the stage to physically block Trump's momentum. She didn't merely interrupt. She launched into a textbook, rapid-fire defense, deploying the exact narrative parameters established by the administration's crisis team months prior. "The American public has already been warned regarding this kind of rhetoric," Philip declared firmly, staring down the camera lens to dictate reality to the viewers. "Exactly what you remain referring to are deceptively characterized, out-of-context videos. The White House press office, alongside independent fact-checkers, possess thoroughly debunked these visual narratives. Those clips of the president were chopped up and manipulated. They are, by definition, deceptive edits." Trump scoffed prominently, leaning backward and shaking his head at the absolute audacity of the spin. But before he could dismantle Phillip's argument, Jake Tapper immediately jumped into the breach to seal the shield wall. And furthermore, Mr. President, Tapper added flawlessly, picking up the momentum with a tone of authoritative exasperation, repeating the exhausted, thoroughly degraded excuse the establishment had clung to for dear life. Regarding the specific time frame you are aggressively targeting, White House physicians issued comprehensive statements clarifying that the president was simply battling a severe cold. To diagnose cognitive failure from a lingering viral infection on a television stage is highly irresponsible. The audacity of the moment hung in the air, telling the American public directly to their faces that the unprecedented cognitive decline they had witnessed on live television week after week was merely a collective hallucination, a trick of the light, a lingering sneeze. Yet the effect on the former First Lady was immediate. The panic that had briefly gripped Jill Biden's features vanished, melting away like ice on a hot stove. She dodged having to defend the indefensible. CNN was achieving it on her behalf. Slowly, deliberately, Jill leaned her shoulders back against the plush leather of her chair. She crossed her legs elegantly, resting her hands in her lap. The frantic, cornered politician from 30 seconds ago was completely gone. In her place sat the untouchable queen of the Beltway. She looked at Trump, then at the moderators, and finally allowed a slow, triumphant, and utterly chilling smile to spread across her face. The elite protectors of the mainstream media had successfully formed a protective barrier around her, and in her mind, the fortress was completely impenetrable. Jill Biden's triumphant smile practically radiated off the stage, anchored by the arrogant certainty that the corporate press would always serve as her personal secret service. Jake Tapper and Abby Phillip were still actively speaking, their voices overlapping in a desperate bid to filibuster the segment with sanitized talking points about edited footage and viral infections. But Trump simply tuned them out entirely. He declined to shout over them. He declined to participate in a petty screaming match against the referees. Instead, he executed a devastating visual maneuver. He slowly turned his head, completely severing eye contact with the moderators and his opponent, and locked his gaze dead center onto the glowing red lens of the primary broadcasting camera. When he finally spoke, the mocking, theatrical cadence of the billionaire showman was gone. His voice dropped into a terrifyingly quiet, icy baritone that sliced straight past the anchors' frantic chatter, forcing the control room to cut their microphones simply to prevent the audio feedback. "A cold," Trump whispered, letting the sheer absurdity of the words suspend in the air. "A cold causes you to sneeze, Jake. It does not make you forget how to formulate a sentence in the English language. But let us bypass the media spin. Simply because the millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms right now aren't stupid. They do not require a CNN fact-checker to tell them what they witnessed. And I certainly lack the need for one, because I wasn't watching it through a television screen. I was standing precisely 6 feet away." Trump leaned forward, his massive frame dominating the camera shot, pulling the entire nation into his perspective of the catastrophic June 2024 presidential debate. "Let us talk about the absolute gravity of that night," Trump continued, his tone methodical and unyielding. "We are discussing the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. At that exact moment, working-class families were being suffocated by record inflation. The southern border was bleeding out from millions of illegal crossings, and the world was standing on the brink of global conflict. And the man tasked with defending the free world. I looked over at his podium, and exactly what I saw wasn't a leader battling the sniffles. I saw a man who was entirely detached from reality. He merely sat exactly there, featuring his jaw hanging from his mouth the entire time, staring blankly into the abyss. He turned his head slightly, shooting a brief, glacial look at Jill before returning to the camera. It was chilling. It wasn't a political opponent standing next to me. It was a non-functioning Biden, an empty shell, an incapacitated prop. He was completely stripped of his cognitive faculties, lost in his own mind, unable to grasp where he was or what was happening. Trump paused, letting the visceral, undeniable imagery settle over the studio. He was articulating the exact, uncomfortable truth that every single American had thought that night. Yet the establishment had forbidden them to say aloud. Now, everyone understands my instinct is to counterpunch, Trump explained, his voice perfectly level, dissecting the political psychology of that historic night. If someone attacks me, I hit back 10 times harder. I could have destroyed him in the first 3 minutes, but I realized resting there that I deserved an Academy Award merely for maintaining composure under pressure, simply because I recognized the trap. Had I launched full guns blazing at Joe Biden when he was standing there looking like a deeply impaired individual, it would have appeared really bad. It would have looked like elder abuse on live television. He aimed a finger toward the ground, anchoring his argument. Therefore, I made a choice. I chose total restraint. I stood perfectly still. I permitted the silence to drag out, and I permitted the President of the United States to speak for himself. And in doing so, I forced the entire country to look past the White House press briefings and see the naked, horrifying reality that Jill Biden had been desperately hiding from them for years. The atmosphere inside the Atlanta studio plummeted into an absolute, suffocating, dead silence. One could hear the faint hum of the studio lights. The audience, usually eager to cheer or boo, was paralyzed by the brutal, graphic honesty of the recount, mostly because they recognized fundamentally that every single word he just uttered remained factual. The impenetrable fortress of the media shield wall shattered instantly. Jill Biden's chilling, triumphant smile didn't merely fade, it collapsed. The color visibly drained from her face. She blinked rapidly, her flawlessly composed posture crumbling while she nervously adjusted the collar of her jacket. She crossed and uncrossed her legs, her eyes darting frantically toward the floor. The panic rested no longer theoretical. The illusion was dead, and Trump had just dragged her into the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute reality. The suffocating silence in the studio wasn't merely palpable. It represented a physical weight pressing down on the collective conscience of the room. Jill Biden shifted, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the leather armrests of her chair. Her breathing remained shallow, erratic. The protective bubble had burst, and the cold, unsparing reality of live, unscripted television was rapidly setting in. Trump refused to allow the silence to dissipate. He permitted it to marinate, savoring the agonizing squirm of a Beltway elite stripped of her teleprompter and her media bodyguards. Slowly, utilizing the deliberate, theatrical flair of a seasoned prosecutor unveiling a lethal instrument, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He extracted a pristine, hardcover book. Her book. He inspected the glossy cover with exaggerated, mocking fascination. You realize, the genuinely captivating element regarding the modern political scam isn't the lie itself, Trump initiated, his voice echoing with deep, biting cynicism. It involves the sheer, unadulterated monetization of the lie. You burn 4 years looking the American public dead in the eye, demanding that they ignore the crippling reality of a crumbling executive branch. Yet the second the gig is up, you pivot. You secure a 7-figure publishing deal to suddenly reveal the hidden struggles you vehemently denied yesterday. It serves as a remarkable business model, truly phenomenal. He declined to throw the memoir. He placed it gently on the table between them, centering it perfectly like a primed explosive. He looked up, bypassing the frantic moderators, directly toward the control booth. Proceed and play the tape. Let us show the good people in this room exactly what a CNN deceptive edit actually looks like. The massive digital screen behind them blinked to life. There was Jill, sitting comfortably on a national morning broadcast, promoting the very book currently resting on the table. The studio's surround sound amplified her trembling, rehearsed confession, filling every corner of the room. I watched it. The televised version of Jill declared, her voice dripping with dramatic terror. I thought, good Lord, he is suffering a severe medical crisis. It terrified me completely, horrified. I was frightened because I had never, ever witnessed Joe in that condition before. The video snapped to black. The sheer, naked absurdity of the contradiction hung in the air. A First Lady admitting on a legacy network that the Commander-in-Chief was undergoing a catastrophic neurological event, whilst the identical network's anchors sat 3 feet away, having recently argued he merely had a cough. The studio audience began to murmur, a low, rumbling undercurrent of shock and outrage that quickly escalated. A man in the third row released a loud, incredulous laugh. The pot was rapidly boiling over. The audience, sensing the catastrophic collapse of the establishment's narrative, Trump leaned aggressively forward, crossing the physical gap separating them, his massive frame dominating her space. He aimed a single, uncompromising finger directly at Jill. Therefore, let us establish the baseline facts. He growled, his voice a low, lethal hum that demanded absolute obedience. You sat down, you authored a memoir, and you appeared on CBS to market it to the American people. Inside that book and within that tape, we merely observed, you explicitly confessed, that you were frightened by his performance in the 2024 presidential debate. He refused to surrender her an inch to breathe, meticulously tearing apart the absurdity of her position. You declined to claim he fought a head cold. You declined to claim he fought travel fatigue or a stutter. You explicitly declared for the historical record that you believed the man gripping the nuclear launch codes was actively suffering a major medical failure on live television. You monetized that specific, terrifying health crisis simply to push hardcover copies at $35 a pop. Jill's polished veneer shattered completely. Her eyes darted frantically across Tapper, Philip, and the roaring crowd, desperately searching for a lifeline that had abruptly evaporated. Her hands shook visibly while she gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. She opened her mouth to speak, stammered a nonsensical syllable, and closed it again, noticeably suffocating beneath the crushing weight of her own contradictory narrative. "Answer him!" somebody shouted from the back of the auditorium, prompting a cascade of angry agreement from the crowd. The studio rested upon the verge of absolute detonation. Therefore, I'm going to ask you a very simple, straightforward question, Trump pressed, his tone devoid of any humor, clamping her inside an inescapable logical vice. And I refuse to hear a filibuster regarding executive privilege or a lecture about democracy. You penned it. You declared it on camera. Did you genuinely believe your husband was suffering a massive medical collapse in front of millions of viewers? Or were you merely fabricating it to the media to push your book? Resolve the inquiry, affirmative or negative, cornered by the indisputable reality of her own lucrative media tour and utterly unable to publicly disavow the memoir she was currently attempting to use as a launchpad for her Senate campaign, her avenues of escape stood reduced to zero. With her jaw clenched incredibly tight, it appeared ready to fracture under the strain. Jill swallowed hard and delivered a single, stiff, almost imperceptible nod. Affirmative. She had currently validated the premise. She had stepped voluntarily onto the tripwire, entirely oblivious to the lethal, inescapable trap lurking on the alternate edge of that single, damning admission. That singular, almost imperceptible nod was all it required. The steel jaws of the trap snapped shut. Trump refused to smile. He refused to gloat. He leaned forward, his expression hardening into the cold, surgical focus of a trial lawyer who had just cornered a hostile witness on the stand. "Excellent. We possess that upon the record," Trump stated, his voice cutting past the tense air resembling a scalpel. "Because here remains the flaw regarding your timeline, Jill. Inside the legal sector, it stands labeled as a perjury trap. You capture somebody inside a demonstrable, verifiable falsehood, and subsequently you compel them to justify the contradiction, and you merely marched straight into it." Jill's eyes widened. She realized instantly exactly what she had accomplished, her posture stiffening, while the panic ultimately pierced past her polished veneer. But it was excessively late. "You literally admitted to the American people that you firmly believed your husband was suffering a life-threatening collapse upon that stage," Trump stated, his pacing slow, methodical, and savagely logical. "Currently, as everybody in this room understands, there exists an ambulance which travels alongside you everywhere you go, whenever you serve as President of the United States. It remains fully staffed. It rests right outside the door. It would prove fairly simple to acquire him immediate medical attention. Therefore, if you genuinely thought he was enduring a catastrophic event, why didn't you summon that ambulance?" He declined to pause for her to respond. He declined to supply her the oxygen. He hammered the facts straight into the narrative, peeling off every ounce of her political defense. "You failed to summon an ambulance. Alternatively, you paraded Joe outward to a rally," Trump spoke, his voice rising, filling the dead-silent studio with absolute authority. "You walked out onto that stage and handled the commander-in-chief as if he were a 3-year-old. You seized the microphone, clapped your hands, and shouted, 'Joe, you executed such a fantastic job!' You answered every question. You grasped all the details." Jill's face flushed a deep, frantic crimson. She gripped the edges of her chair, her knuckles turning bone-white, completely unable to formulate a defense against the raw sequence of events. "Yet you didn't halt exactly there," Trump pushed, elevating the volume, projecting the collective outrage of the audience. "After parading a man you allegedly thought was dying in front of the cameras, you declined to transport him to Walter Reed Medical Center. You dragged him to a Waffle House diner at midnight." A diner. He shifted his gaze away from Jill toward the audience, and subsequently directly into the broadcast camera, ensuring every voter at home absorbed the sheer absurdity of her actions. "I desire everybody observing to ask themselves an incredibly simple question. Is this exactly what you execute for a critically ill patient? Is this exactly what you execute whenever you suspect someone has suffered a massive neurological collapse? You drag them to a restaurant at midnight where nobody possesses any idea what remains occurring, simply to manufacture a photo op?" He turned back toward Jill, his eyes locked onto hers, featuring lethal precision. The final blow rested ready. The logic stood utterly airtight, destroying her credibility before the jury of the American public. "It remains a physical impossibility to hold both of these truths, Jill," Trump declared, delivering the decisive strike with devastating clarity. "You cannot be terrified that your husband is dying and simultaneously utilize him as a prop to request hash browns for the cameras. Therefore, which is it? Were you deceiving the public back then when you covered up his cognitive collapse to hold on to your power? Or are you deceiving us exactly currently to sell this book?" The question struck with the concussive force of a bomb. There existed zero executive privilege to hide behind. There existed zero media spin that could untangle the contradiction. She rested, pinned to the wall by her own actions, entirely suffocated by the inescapable reality of her own hypocrisy. For a grueling 10 seconds, there was zero audio across the CNN broadcast. Jill Biden's lips opened, yet nothing emerged. The polished, defiant politician had vanished, substituted by a cornered suspect choking on her own words. She stammered, a broken, incoherent hum leaking from her throat, while she discovered herself completely incapable of reconciling the colossal, logical contradiction laid bare before the nation. The anchors declined to toss her a lifeline this time. The institutional survival instinct activated. Recognizing that their star guest remained politically radioactive, Abby Phillip and Jake Tapper launched a brutal, instantaneous pivot to salvage the network's remaining credibility. "Dr. Biden," Abby Phillip interjected, her tone completely devoid of its previous warmth, shedding the defensive posture to target directly toward the former First Lady. "The president remains correct. The timeline you are presenting is fundamentally deceptive. You cannot claim to remain terrified for his life and subsequently organize a late-night diner photo op. That represents a blatant, televised falsehood. Are you merely lying to our viewers exactly right now?" Betrayed by her most reliable allies on live television, pure panic consumed her. Her eyes filled with frantic, desperate tears. The ultimate defense mechanism of a collapsing narrative. "You fail to comprehend," Jill shrieked out, her voice cracking while she aimed a trembling finger toward the cameras, desperately attempting to sacrifice her own people. "It remained outside my decision. The campaign managers, the senior strategists, they orchestrated the Waffle House stop. They pushed him out there. They forced me to play along with it to project strength. I possessed no choice." Trump declined to elevate his voice to speak above her sobbing. He merely reached into his pocket a final time and extracted a folded sheet of paper. "I anticipated you possessed the intent to throw your own team under the bus when the walls ultimately closed in," Trump stated with cold precision. "Therefore, let us listen to whatever your own team has to declare." He unfolded the document, smoothing it out upon the table. "This represents a public statement released tonight, originating from a former senior staffer inside your husband's campaign. I shall read it verbatim." Jill's comments during her media tour are pure revisionist history. She, alongside a handful of close advisors, continued gaslighting us. They looked the campaign staff in the eye and told us we were the individuals who were wrong, claiming he merely had a bad night. Trump flicked the letter upon the table directly adjacent to her memoir. "You failed to merely deceive the voters, Jill. You systematically and psychologically manipulated your own loyal staff to keep the grift alive." The last defensive barrier stood annihilated. Jill Biden slumped downward, her chin dropping toward her chest. The arrogant, triumphant posture she had carried onto the stage was gone, replaced by the hollow, silent submission of a completely defeated operative. She stared blindly at the table, offering absolutely zero rebuttal. Trump rose vertically, slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, commanding authority, towering over the desk. He bypassed the moderators completely, looking directly into the primary broadcast lens to execute an icy, iconic closing argument. "Exactly what you are looking at tonight represents the true nature of the Beltway machine," Trump announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "They remain incredibly addicted to power. They act like a golem-like figure desperately searching for his treasure. They remain completely ruthless, prepared to exploit and parade a severely ailing husband simply to maintain their grip on the Oval Office. It represents pure, unadulterated evil." He clenched his jaw, broadcasting a final decree toward the American public. "And simply because they possess the will to execute absolutely anything for power, they require being fought. They require being destroyed politically, and we require taking away their power permanently." He turned his back away from the desk. The control room instantly severed the live feed, leaving the viewers with a final, indelible, frozen frame. President Trump standing in absolute victory, commanding the stage, whilst the former First Lady rested, diminished, and broken within his shadow. The fallout proved catastrophic and immediate. Come sunrise, the mainstream broadcast networks had quietly scrubbed the phrase deceptive edits off their banners. Shifting to wall-to-wall programming, dissecting the deception of the era, buckling beneath an unprecedented wave of public fury, the Department of Justice announced the reopening regarding the previously frozen corruption probes concerning the Biden family's foreign business dealings. Meanwhile, retail conglomerates launched massive boycotts regarding Jill's memoir. Her highly anticipated Senate campaign was suffocated inside its crib prior to it even getting officially launched. Emerging out of the wreckage completely vindicated, the Trump administration projected absolute strength, consolidating unquestionable momentum, advancing into the critical midterm elections.